The American Civil War was one of the most intense and defining chapters in the history of the United States. Amidst the confrontation between the North and the South, issues such as slavery and national identity deeply divided the country, creating a scenario of chaos and uncertainty. But beyond human battles, there are stories that go beyond common logic accounts of supernatural occurrences that have left their mark on the collective memory. Among these stories, one in particular defies rational explanation: the rumors of werewolves on the front lines. These curious stories have been passed down through generations and have survived in documents, letters, and testimonies from the time. But where did these legends come from? Were they simply reflections of the soldiers' fear and stress? Or perhaps something truly unknown was lurking in the regions devastated by war? Here, you'll explore a lesser-known side of the Civil War. We'll review documents, analyze testimonies, and learn theories that suggest a link between the supernatural and the conflicts of the time. If these stories raise more questions than answers, it is because in times of war, the line between reality and legend is very thin. After all, how can we explain the shadows and mysterious creatures that seemed to appear during one of the darkest periods in American history? To understand the stories of werewolves during the Civil War, it is important to know a little about the folklore of the time and how these legends reached the United States. In the 19th century, the myth of werewolves was already a well-known cultural element in Europe, especially in countries such as France, Germany, and England. With European immigration to the United States, these stories of creatures that transformed under the full moon were brought by communities seeking a new home. And it wasn't long before these myths found fertile ground in rural and mountainous America, where fear of the unknown was already part of everyday life. In rural areas and isolated communities, werewolf stories took on a life of their own, being passed down from generation to generation. Furthermore, life in the American forests and mountains was itself surrounded by real mysteries and dangers. Wild animals and extensive forest areas fueled the popular imagination, and any unknown sound in the dead of night could be interpreted as the presence of a supernatural creature. This scenario of isolation and uncertainty caused the folklore of werewolves to take hold in people's minds, especially in times of conflict, when fear and uncertainty were at their peak. During the Civil War, close contact between soldiers from different regions helped spread these supernatural stories. In camps and trenches, the nights were long and stories of dark creatures were told around the campfires. Soldiers, exposed to the stress of combat and extreme conditions, absorbed these legends as a way of making sense of the unseen dangers that surrounded them. The werewolf, a figure that represents transformation and savagery, became a symbol of the very fears that haunted the battlefields. Furthermore, the brutality and deprivation of war could, for many, make the unimaginable more plausible. In times of chaos, the supernatural offers an explanation for that which cannot be easily understood. Werewolf stories, then, served as a reflection of human fears, symbolizing both the internal horrors and the external threats that haunted soldiers. The myth, reinforced by oral tradition and the war environment, gained strength, leaving its mark on the accounts that have survived over time. So when we talk about werewolves in the Civil War, we are dealing with a unique combination of folklore, fear, and historical context that intertwine. Werewolves, in the eyes of those who lived through the conflict, were not just creatures of fairy tales, but also representations of the deeper terrors that war brought to the surface. Amid the destruction and chaos of the Civil War, some accounts stand out for their extraordinary nature. Among soldiers' letters, personal diaries, and even military documents, descriptions emerge that go beyond what is expected of a human conflict. These records mention encounters with mysterious creatures resembling werewolves, bringing a supernatural dimension to the battlefields. A striking example is a letter written by an anonymous Confederate soldier describing a particularly terrifying night. In his correspondence, he mentions having seen a bestial figure with human features, but which moved with the speed and instinct of a wild animal. In his account, the soldier admits that for a moment, he did not know whether he was dealing with a human being or something beyond his familiarity. The detailed descriptions of sharp fangs and eyes that glowed in the dark are unsettling, and his hesitation to believe what he saw only reinforces the mystery. In addition to letters, personal diaries also contain references to these mysterious creatures. In a diary found years after the war, a Union soldier mentions the presence of wolves that looked more than wolves. He describes unusual sounds and shadows lurking around the camps, enough to make many soldiers alert, even after grueling combat tours. These accounts are not easy to ignore, as they show that the fear came not only from enemy soldiers, but also from an unseen, almost supernatural threat. There are also mentions in official documents of officers receiving unusual reports from their subordinates. In some cases, these observations were recorded with vague descriptions, such as suspicious presences or animals behaving strangely in the vicinity of combat areas. Although these official records are discreet, they indicate that the stories were common enough to be communicated hierarchically. The extreme circumstances, isolation, and constant tension seem to have created a fertile environment for these stories to emerge. These testimonies, whether detailed or brief, reflect the psychological impact that war had on soldiers. Under such intense conditions, it is difficult to determine where reality ends and imagination begins. However, the repetition and similarity between the accounts point to something deeper, the perception that there was a greater danger than just human confrontation. This mystery, which documents and reports from the time keep alive to this day, brings a layer of complexity and fascination to those trying to understand the mentality of Civil War soldiers. Reports of encounters with the unexplained not only broaden our understanding of what these men endured, but also reveal a need to understand the unknown. This desire to understand and make sense of the supernatural phenomena witnessed in times of war resonates to this day, keeping stories like these alive. After all, what exactly did these soldiers see or believe they saw on the battlefields? When we think about reports of werewolves during the Civil War, several theories arise to try to explain these phenomena. For some, these supernatural encounters may have been the result of the minds of the soldiers themselves, who, under immense stress and in extreme conditions, may have projected their fears into fantastic forms. The brutality and intensity of the war led these men to face situations of physical and psychological exhaustion, a fertile ground for collective hallucinations and supernatural interpretations of common events. A common theory is that isolation and combat conditions heightened popular beliefs about the supernatural. In camps and trenches, where soldiers from different regions and cultures met, stories of werewolves mixed and expanded, creating an atmosphere of suspense that could transform any suspicious noise into a monstrous threat. In a war scenario, where tensions were at their highest, local folklore gained a new dimension, and reports of werewolves helped to explain the dangers that seemed to go beyond human confrontation. There is also the possibility that, in certain regions where forest and wilderness were predominant, animals such as wolves and coyotes were mistaken for something supernatural. At night, poor visibility and soldiers' fatigue could easily distort their perception, leading them to interpret figures in the dark as something out of the ordinary. Furthermore, the idea that some combat locations were cursed territories was already part of many people's beliefs, which reinforced fear and the supernatural interpretation of mysterious events. Another interesting point of view is that these werewolf stories, in addition to representing internal fears, were also a way of symbolizing the savagery of war itself. The figure of the werewolf, a creature that moves between the human and the bestial, represented the very state of transformation that war provoked in soldiers. In a way, The legend of werewolves may have served as a metaphor for the psychological and emotional changes they experienced, creating a link between the supernatural and the brutality of reality. These theories do not offer a definitive answer, but they help us understand the context in which these reports emerged. Independentemente serum alucines, misturas de medo y cultura popular os emelas das experiencias humanas en tempos de guerra, as historias de lobisomens na guerra de suceso nos lembram de como a mente humana busca formas de dar sentido ao desconhecido. E, na ausência de respostas claras, o sobrenatural se torna uma explicação poderosa e duradoura. The supernatural accounts of the Civil War, especially of werewolves, were not just scare stories. They had a real impact on the morale of soldiers. On the battlefield, where tension was already high, rumors of mysterious creatures prowling camps heightened anxiety and fear. The possibility of an unknown threat, something beyond the human enemy, amplified soldiers' sense of vulnerability, undermining their confidence and affecting their readiness to face the next day of combat. On many occasions, stories about werewolves and other supernatural presences influenced the behavior of soldiers. There are records that show that some soldiers preferred to avoid night patrols in places considered cursed or where sightings had supposedly occurred. This extra fear often forced commanders to reorganize shifts and strategies, considering the effect of these legends on the disposition of the troops. The mere suspicion that a supernatural enemy could be lurking was enough to change the mood in the camp, generating a wave of caution and, in some cases, even panic. Furthermore, the psychological impact of the supernatural affected the way soldiers viewed war. In the midst of such a desolate scenario, stories of creatures like werewolves became a representation of the internal horrors that each soldier carried. The figure of the werewolf, with its duality between the human and the bestial, was a powerful metaphor for the brutality many faced on a daily basis. Believing in a supernatural presence offered a way to externalize and understand the fear they felt, allowing them to make sense of the intense feelings that war evoked. Nights spent in darkness and silence only reinforced these fears. Fear of the unknown transformed every shadow and noise into a possible threat, and the idea that supernatural creatures roamed the battlefields was a shared fear. This fear had the power to create a sense of unity, and at the same time, isolation, as each soldier dealt with his own interpretations of the reports. These stories of werewolves and the psychological impact of the supernatural were therefore more than just a curiosity of the time. They show how human beings react to situations of extreme stress and how belief in something beyond the natural can directly influence the way we interpret danger. Ultimately, these legends contributed to the fabric of the soldiers' experience, shaping how they dealt with the challenges of war and influencing troop morale during one of the darkest periods in American history. Some specific locations during the Civil War are particularly well known for supernatural stories and sightings of mysterious creatures. Certain regions, especially those that are more isolated and difficult to access, became frequent settings for these stories, further reinforcing the folklore surrounding the conflict. These areas, where superstition and isolation were already strong, ended up playing an important role in perpetuating the legends of werewolves and other creatures. One such location was the state of Virginia, which saw some of the fiercest and most intense fighting of the war. Many soldiers believed that the dense forests of the region were home not only to wild animals, but also to supernatural creatures. The tall trees and thick undergrowth made it difficult to see, creating a gloomy atmosphere that fueled fear. Stories of shadowy figures lurking in the trees circulated among the troops, and many soldiers claimed to have seen different wolves that seemed to watch their every move with uncanny intelligence. Another state with a high concentration of supernatural stories was Georgia. The mountains and uninhabited regions of this area were the scene of mysterious encounters, according to the stories that soldiers exchanged in the trenches. It was common for soldiers to avoid night patrols in these places, believing that something inexplicable was lurking there. These stories ended up being reinforced by local communities, who also had their own legends of werewolves, which only contributed to spreading even more fear among the troops. Tennessee, another important theater of the conflict, also frequently appears in reports of supernatural encounters. The battlefields and more deserted areas of the state were described as environments where nocturnal beings would often appear. Residents of nearby areas claimed to hear screams and howls during the night, sounds that many soldiers and civilians interpreted as the presence of supernatural creatures. Such testimonies generated even more tension, and stories of werewolves and mysterious beings circulated quickly. These regional accounts show how the geography and natural features of each location contributed to fueling the supernatural imagery of the Civil War. In remote areas where dense forest or rugged mountains isolated soldiers and civilians, fear of the unknown mixed with local folklore, creating an atmosphere that reinforced the legends. The combination of isolated locations, intense battles, and the presence of local stories created a unique supernatural narrative, immortalized in accounts of the most haunted regions of the conflict. Each of these sites represents a piece of the puzzle of how the supernatural became part of the Civil War. They remind us that the war was experienced differently in each state, and that for many, the presence of an unseen threat was as real as the fighting on the battlefield. The phenomenon of supernatural tales during wartime is not unique to the Civil War. Throughout history, in different parts of the world, periods of conflict have often been accompanied by stories of mysterious creatures, ghostly apparitions, and other unexplained phenomena. This pattern suggests that, faced with the chaos and suffering of war, humans turn to elements of folklore and the supernatural to make sense of experiences that are beyond comprehension. During World War and World War II, for example, there were also reports of encounters with supernatural figures. During World War I, soldiers in the trenches spoke of apparitions known as the Angels of Mons, mysterious figures rumored to appear to protect or comfort soldiers. During World War II, stories of ghosts and spirits of fallen soldiers were told on several fronts, creating a narrative of supernatural presence amid the horror of the conflict. Comparing these accounts to other conflicts helps us better understand the psychological impact of war. Under extreme pressure, soldiers and civilians face life and death situations on a daily basis, and the supernatural appears as an outlet for fear and suffering. In accounts of the Civil War, werewolves represent this fear of the unknown and, in a way, serve as a metaphor for the savagery and dehumanization that war imposes on all involved. These stories also show how culture and context influence the supernatural manifestations reported at different times. In the United States in the 19th century, legends about werewolves were popular and part of the collective imagination. In other periods and places, the same need to make sense of the suffering of war gave rise to different types of legends and apparitions. In each case, the supernatural offers a way to explain the inexplicable and to externalize the emotional impact of combat. Thus, by examining accounts of werewolves in the Civil War alongside supernatural stories from other conflicts, we realize that the supernatural in times of war is a universal phenomenon. It shows us how the human mind, amid horror and uncertainty, searches for explanations that go beyond reality, creating legends that span generations. Given the many accounts of werewolves and other supernatural creatures during the Civil War, the inevitable question arises: to what extent do these testimonies reflect reality? Interpreting these stories is a challenge, as they combine folklore, personal experiences, and the influence of a war environment where fear and extreme stress became everyday life. The line between reality and imagination, in this context, is quite thin. Some believe that reports of werewolves are exaggerations created by the soldiers' fear and exhaustion. Under the weight of conflict and constant deprivation, the human mind is prone to distortions, making it possible for noises and shadows to be mistaken for supernatural creatures. This theory argues that the stressful nature of war creates fertile ground for supernatural interpretations, especially at a time when folklore was a part of many soldiers' daily lives. On the other hand, there are those who believe that these accounts may contain some truth, although it is difficult to prove. Even if the soldiers had not actually encountered werewolves, the similarities in the testimonies and the intensity of the experiences suggest that these men experienced something extraordinary. In times of war, the inexplicable gains strength, and the supernatural becomes a possible explanation for the unknown that surrounds the battlefield. Ultimately, whether out of fear, belief, or a combination of both, accounts of werewolves in the Civil War reflect the complexity of the human spirit in extreme situations. These testimonies, whether real or imagined, remind us that war is a terrain where reality and myth often intertwine, creating stories that defy our understanding and remain vivid in the collective memory. Werewolf tales from the Civil War are more than just stories of fear. They represent the psychological and cultural impact that the war left on later generations. These legends highlight human frailty in the face of the unknown, especially in times of conflict when the mind seeks ways to make sense of the horror and chaos. These stories, even without factual confirmation, have enriched American folklore, adding a supernatural twist to the already complex history of the Civil War. As we reflect on these accounts, we are reminded of how legends and myths live on, offering solace and a sense of mystery across the centuries.